Hey guys, tonight we begin with a drug that briefly convinced an entire generation that sleep was optional, strangers were fascinating, and weekends were capable of lasting forever. People took it on Friday nights and occasionally returned home sometime around Monday afternoon, with 3 new friends, no serotonin, and extremely ambitious opinions about afterparties. Its name was Mephedrone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow, immersive history. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are right now, and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into one of the strangest, fastest, most thoroughly modern disasters in the history of drug policy. In the autumn of 2009, something happened in British universities that had never quite happened before. Students discovered they could order drugs the same way they ordered everything else. You went to a website, you put something in a basket, you paid with a card. It arrived the next day in a plain packet, discreet, unremarkable, the kind of thing that sits on a doorstep without raising any questions from anyone passing by. The label said plant food. The small print said not for human consumption. Inside was a white powder that its users described as doing roughly what MDMA and cocaine did, combined at a fraction of the price, with a purity that the street alternatives hadn't seen in years. It was at that moment completely legal, and within 9 months it was the 4th most popular drug in the United Kingdom. None of this happened through advertising. There were no billboards, no television campaigns, no press releases from anyone. The way it spread was through forums and group chats, and the oldest mechanism in the world, which is one person telling another person about something good they found. Except now that mechanism ran at internet speed, and the thing being recommended could be at your door the next morning without either of you having to leave the house or speak to anyone who might arrest you. This was the first drug that an entire generation could approach, the same way they approached everything else they bought online. Read the reviews, compare the options, pay by card, wait for delivery. The friction that had always made drug taking a slightly dangerous, slightly criminal transaction, the dealer, the uncertainty, the risk of buying something that turned out to be something else, was gone. The websites filed their taxes, some of them advertised on Google. The economics of it were, from the vendor's side, almost absurdly attractive. A kilogram of mephedrone could be synthesized in a Chinese laboratory for a couple of £100. Shipping it to the United Kingdom cost roughly £2,500. At the retail end, it sold for £10 a gram. The profit on a single kilogram was approximately £7,500. That margin existed not because of scarcity or risk or the complexity of the supply chain, but simply because the product was good and people wanted it. There was no criminal premium embedded in the price, no charge for the danger of handling illegal goods, no commission for a dealer taking personal risk by standing on a corner. The vendor was, legally speaking, running a small business. The product was, legally speaking, plant food. The only fiction required was the label, and that fiction was thin enough to be essentially transparent, and everyone involved understood that perfectly well and proceeded anyway. The name everyone outside of that world gave it was meow meow. This was almost exclusively a tabloid invention. The people who actually used it called it meth, or drone, or MCAT, or simply it, the way you refer to something once everyone in the room already knows what you mean. Meow meow was the name you saw in newspapers next to photographs of teenagers who may or may not have taken it, under headlines that may or may not have been accurate. It was the name that told you this was a story about panic rather than pharmacology. By the time the panic arrived in full, the drug had already been in a significant fraction of the country's veins for the better part of a year. The molecule itself is older than almost anyone involved in this story. 4-methylmethcathinone, its chemical name, was first synthesized in 1929 as part of a broader effort to develop pharmaceutical compounds. It was not found particularly interesting at the time. Nobody published much about it. Nobody tried to sell it or study it or use it recreationally. It was filed away in the general archive of things that had been made and then forgotten, which is a very large archive, and it sat there undisturbed for the better part of 70 years. What brought it back was not a pharmaceutical company or a government research program, it was the internet. In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, a small community of chemists, most of them anonymous, began gathering on underground forums to discuss what they called research chemicals. These were synthetic compounds that existed in legal grey areas, had interesting psychoactive properties, and had not yet attracted the attention of regulators. The community was not simply people looking for a legal way to get high, though some of them were that. Many were genuinely curious about pharmacology. Some had been deeply influenced by the work of Alexander Shulgin, an American chemist who had spent decades synthesizing new psychedelic and entactogenic compounds, self-testing every one of them, writing up the results in precise and often lyrical detail, and publishing the findings in a series of books that became central texts for anyone interested in the outer edges of psychopharmacology. Shulgin's philosophy was essentially that the human mind had a right to explore itself, that the chemist's role was to create the tools for that exploration, and that the legal status of a compound was a political fact rather than a moral one. His influence on the research chemical community was enormous, and it established a particular tone for the whole enterprise: curious, methodical, self-aware, and completely unintimidated by the disapproval of official bodies. The forum they gathered on most prominently was called the Hive. It was a place where synthesis routes were discussed in technical detail, where experience reports were filed with the seriousness of scientific literature, and where the question of which compounds were worth exploring and which were too dangerous was debated by people who had, in many cases, actually tried both. It was not a criminal enterprise in any conventional sense. It was closer to an academic community that had decided to study a subject the Academy had declined to touch. In April of 2003, a user called Kinetic posted to the Hive. The post described the synthesis and personal experience of 4-methylmethcathinone. Kinetic had made some, taken some, and was reporting back with the enthusiasm of someone who has just found something genuinely good. The effect, Kinetic wrote, gave a fantastic sense of well-being that they had not got from any drug before except beloved ecstasy. The communication centres, they said, were gaping wide. The empathy was significant. This was, in other words, the world's first published review of Mephedrone. It read less like a scientific report and more like a recommendation from a friend who wants you to try the restaurant they just discovered. Kinetic's identity was never established. The name was a handle, the post was anonymous, and whoever was behind it has remained unknown. What they left behind was a synthesis route and a trip report, essentially a recipe and a testimonial, for a compound that was, at the time, uncontrolled in almost every country on Earth. You could legally make it, you could legally possess it, you could legally sell it, provided you were careful about how you described what you were selling. Around the same time, and apparently without knowledge of Kinetic's post, a different person arrived at the same molecule by a different route. His name, or the name he used, was Dr. Z. He was Israeli. He was not actually a doctor. The title was self-appointed, in the spirit of someone who has decided that credentials are beside the point when you already know what you're doing. Dr. Z's approach to drug chemistry was explicitly philosophical. He described his work as freedom of consciousness chemistry, the idea that people had a right to alter their own mental states, that the existing legal framework around drugs was arbitrary and politically rather than scientifically motivated, and that his role was to explore the territory that the law had cordoned off and report back from it. He tested everything on himself first. This was either admirable or alarming depending on your perspective, and it was probably a little of both. What Dr. Z noticed, working in Israel in the early 2000s, was a particular gap. The Yemenite Jewish community in Israel had a long tradition of chewing khat, a plant whose leaves contain cathinone, a mild and natural stimulant that had been used across the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. Khat itself was legal in Israel. Cathinone as a standalone synthetic compound existed in a grey area. Dr. Z began synthesizing a stronger version of it and packaging it in small capsules he called Hagigat. They were sold openly, initially to the Yemenite community as a synthetic equivalent of what they were already using, and then to a broader recreational market as word spread about what they actually did. The small firm he worked with, Neorganics, began selling the product commercially under the name Neodovs around 2004. This was the first time Mephedrone had been commercially sold as a recreational product, openly and legally, in a physical shop. The model was simple. The product existed in a legal space that the law had not yet thought to close. It worked, and it was therefore worth selling. Israel's drug authorities noticed. In January of 2008, Israel became the first country in the world to make Mephedrone illegal. Neorganics discontinued the range. Dr. Z moved on to other projects. He was never short of projects, and the Israeli chapter closed. It looked, at that point, like the end of a minor story. A chemist had found a legal gap, exploited it, a government had noticed and closed it, and things returned to roughly normal. This was the expected trajectory. This was how it was supposed to go. The pattern was familiar. A novel compound appears in a grey area, circulates in a small community, attracts enough attention that regulators act, and then disappears back into the archive of things that were tried and subsequently prohibited. Tidy, unremarkable, the kind of story that never generates a second paragraph. It would have gone that way, probably, if something hadn't happened in Cambodia 4 months later. In June of 2008, on the other side of the world from any British university, the government of Cambodia did something entirely routine. They found some chemicals and destroyed them. 33 tons of an oil called safrole, used to manufacture MDMA. It was, by any measure, a success. It was also the moment the door opened. Safrole is an oil. It comes from the roots and bark of the sassafras tree, and from a handful of other plants found in tropical forests. Cambodia had particularly large quantities of it. On its own, it smells faintly of anise. It has uses in perfume and flavouring, and for most of its existence, it was a fairly unremarkable agricultural product. Then someone worked out it was also the key precursor for manufacturing MDMA, and after that it became something rather more interesting to a significant number of people, including eventually the United Nations. The UN had been trying to restrict safrole since the late 1990s. The logic was straightforward. If you couldn't make MDMA because the raw material wasn't available, you couldn't sell it, and if you couldn't sell it, people would stop taking it. This is the theory behind precursor control, and it is, in principle, entirely sensible. In practice, it ran into the usual problem with supply-side drug enforcement, which is that demand does not disappear because supply has been disrupted. It relocates, it improvises, it finds another route. For a while, Cambodia became that route. Production camps moved into protected forests, where oversight was limited and the trees were plentiful. By 2007, the Cambodian government was conducting raids, seizing equipment, burning crops. By June of 2008, they had found and destroyed 33 tons of safrole in a single operation, enough, according to later estimates, to produce approximately 245 million ecstasy pills. The United Nations considered this a significant victory, and it was, in the narrow sense that a very large quantity of a controlled precursor had been removed from the supply chain. What happened next was not exactly what anyone had planned. The ecstasy market did not collapse. The ecstasy market adapted. The pills kept appearing, the same size, the same colours, the same logos pressed into them. Smiley faces, doves, the occasional corporate brand appropriated without permission, as was traditional. What changed was what was inside them. By 2009, the average ecstasy pill in the United Kingdom contained roughly 22% MDMA, down from approximately 60% before the safrole disruption. By the time June of 2010 arrived, forensic testing of seized pills found that almost none of them contained any MDMA at all. Not a trace. The pill that had defined a generation of British nightlife had become, In chemical terms, a prop. It looked right. It had the weight and the feel of the real thing. Inside it was mostly benzylpiperazine, amphetamine sulfate, caffeine, and whatever else the manufacturer had found convenient that week. People were paying £10 to £15 for something that did approximately nothing they had expected, and the dealer naturally was not offering refunds. This is the part of the story that tends to get missed when people talk about the rise of mephedrone, as if it were a mystery. It was not a mystery. It was a market correction. An entire recreational drug ecosystem had been hollowed out from underneath, and the people who used those drugs noticed immediately, because you notice when something stops working, and they began looking for something that did. Cocaine was not offering much comfort either. The average purity of cocaine sold on British streets had fallen from around 60% in the late 90s to approximately 22% by 2009. What made up the other 78% varied by batch and by dealer, but the options included benzocaine, lidocaine, levamisole, a livestock deworming agent, phenacetine, a painkiller banned in most countries due to kidney damage, and an assortment of other white powders that had the advantage of being cheap and the disadvantage of being in your cocaine. A gram of what was sold as cocaine in 2009 was, by weight, roughly 1/5 cocaine and 4/5 optimism. Users knew this. They had known it for years. They had adapted by buying more of it and being quietly disappointed by all of it, which is not a sustainable arrangement. Into this gap, the gap left by ecstasy that contained no ecstasy, and cocaine that was mostly not cocaine, arrived mephedrone. It had been sitting in the background of the British drug scene since 2007, known to a small community of forum users and early adopters, available from a handful of online vendors, priced at around £10 a gram. It was a synthetic cathinone, chemically related to the compound found naturally in khat, the leaf chewed across the Horn of Africa. It was not glamorous. It did not have the cultural history of MDMA or the status associations of cocaine. What it had was purity. At the point of sale, mephedrone was running at approximately 98% purity, not 70, not 50, 98. In a market where the competition was 1/5 cocaine and 4/5 livestock dewormer, this was a remarkable selling point. The price made it more remarkable still. A kilogram could be synthesized in a Chinese laboratory for a couple of £100. Shipping it to the United Kingdom cost roughly £2,500 all in. At £10 a gram retail, the profit on a single kilogram was approximately £7,500, and that profit came with no criminal risk attached, because the product, in 2008 and into 2009, was completely legal. There was no risk premium to absorb, no danger money to factor into the price. The vendor was running a small business, the margins were extraordinary, the product was genuine. Neil Wood spent 14 years working as an undercover drugs officer in Britain, buying from dealers, building prosecutions, watching the street market from the inside. He tracked the statistics on drug-related deaths carefully, as people in that line of work tend to do. What he found when he looked at the cocaine death figures for 2009 surprised him. They had fallen. The only year since the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971 that cocaine deaths had actually declined was the year mephedrone was at its most popular. His explanation was direct. Street cocaine in 2009 was 20% purity, with up to 11 different adulterants, some of them genuinely dangerous. Mephedrone was 98% purity with nothing in it except mephedrone. From a pure harm standpoint, the illegal drug was more dangerous than the legal one. This was not the framing that would eventually appear in the newspapers. By December of 2009, the picture was clear enough that Mixmag, the clubbing and dance music magazine that conducted regular surveys of drug use among its readers, found mephedrone sitting at number 4 in the rankings of Britain's most popular drugs, behind cannabis, behind cocaine, which at that point was largely not cocaine, behind ecstasy, which at that point was largely not ecstasy, ahead of everything else. the drug that nobody in authority had heard of 6 months earlier, sold on websites as plant food, advertised on Google, delivered by post with a next-day service, had in 9 months become the 4th most popular recreational substance in the United Kingdom. The speed of it is still the part that defies easy explanation, even with the market vacuum to account for it. Drugs had always spread through social networks, through the passing of a pill between friends, through the slow accumulation of reputation over months and years. Mephedrone spread through the internet, through forums where thousands of people were discussing it simultaneously, through group chats where one person's recommendation arrived in seconds to a dozen others, through a review culture that let you read about someone else's experience before you had your own. A student in Newcastle and a student in Brighton and a student in Birmingham were all encountering the same information at the same moment and making the same decision. The geography that had always slowed a drug's spread simply did not apply. The internet did not have geography. It had bandwidth, and in 2009 there was plenty of it. By the time the calendar turned to 2010, an entire generation had already made its decision. They had tried the ecstasy and found it wanting. They had tried the cocaine and found it wanting. They had found something that worked, that was pure, that cost less, that arrived by post, and they had told everyone they knew. The government had not been paying attention. The scientists had only just begun to notice. The tabloids had not yet found a name for it. And somewhere in a student flat, another plain packet was sitting on a doorstep, labelled not for human consumption, waiting for someone to come home. It had done all of this without a single advertisement beyond the ones it placed on Google itself, without a single street dealer, without a single back-alley transaction or suspicious handshake. It had done it through the post, through a credit card terminal, through a website that filed its taxes. And by the time anyone in authority had looked up from whatever they were doing and asked what exactly was in that packet, the answer had already changed a generation. The parallel collapse was happening across Europe, not just in Britain. In the Netherlands, the proportion of ecstasy tablets containing no MDMA rose from 10% in mid-2008 to 60% by mid-2009. Mephedrone began appearing in what were sold as ecstasy tablets. 20% of Dutch ecstasy pills tested in mid-2009 contained it, not as MDMA but as a substitute that the manufacturer had slipped in, correctly calculating that the person swallowing the pill would not know the difference until they did, and that by then the transaction would be complete. This was, in its own way, a kind of quality control failure so complete it had become a different product entirely. The benzylpeprazine problem made things worse before the mephedrone solution arrived. BZP, as it was known, was a synthetic stimulant that had been used as a veterinary anthelmintic, a treatment for intestinal parasites in livestock, before someone noticed it produced mild stimulant effects in humans and began marketing it as a legal ecstasy substitute. It was weaker than MDMA, lasted longer, and produced a come-down that users described with consistent and vivid unhappiness. By 2008, it was filling a significant proportion of the pills sold as ecstasy in the British market, which meant that someone who had paid £15 for an ecstasy experience was instead receiving something closer to a prolonged and unsatisfying approximation of it, followed by a hangover that outlasted most short holidays. The UK government banned BZP in December of 2009. The timing was, from Mephedrone's perspective, almost perfect. The last significant competitor had been removed from the legal market at precisely the moment mephedrone was becoming widely known. What the adulterants in cocaine were doing to people's bodies was a story that had not yet fully entered public consciousness, but it was being documented in emergency rooms and toxicology labs with increasing frequency. Levamisole, the livestock deworming agent that had become a standard cocaine adulterant, was linked to a condition called agranulocytosis, a severe reduction in white blood cells that left users vulnerable to infections their bodies could not fight. Cases were emerging in the United States and Canada, and the pattern was beginning to appear in British clinical data. Phenacetin, Another common adulterant was associated with kidney damage with prolonged use. The 20% of each gram that was actually cocaine was doing what cocaine does. The other 80% was doing something else entirely, and not all of it was benign. None of this was, in 2009, widely publicised. The public conversation about cocaine remained largely concerned with the drug itself, rather than what it had become in transit from source to street. The people selling it had no interest in accuracy. The people buying it had limited options. The result was a market in which the product had degraded significantly, while the price had not, and the customers were aware of this and unhappy about it and looking, in the way that dissatisfied consumers always look, for an alternative. The alternative was already there, in a plain packet on the doorstep, at £10 a gram, 98% pure, next-day delivery. It did not require a dealer. It did not require a transaction in a car park or a text message that both parties pretended was about something else. It required a website, a credit card, and the willingness to accept that the packet said plant food, and the small print said not for human consumption, and none of that was the point. The arrangement was transparent. The fiction was maintained because the law required a fiction, not because anyone believed it. And it worked, in a market where almost nothing else did, with a consistency that the alternatives had long since abandoned. The generation that adopted Mephedrone so quickly was not, it should be said, a generation that had abandoned all judgment. They were, by and large, people who had been using drugs recreationally for some time, and who had developed, through experience, a fairly accurate sense of what worked and what didn't. They had noticed that the ecstasy wasn't ecstasy. They had noticed that the cocaine was mostly not cocaine. They had found something that was exactly what it claimed to be, at a price that made sense, available through a channel they already trusted. The decision was not reckless. It was rational, in the specific and limited sense that most consumer decisions are rational. It solved a problem more effectively than the available alternatives. That the problem was obtaining recreational drugs, and the solution was a synthetic cathinon ordered from a website selling plant food, is detail that the story requires but the logic does not depend on. The websites had names that made no effort to disguise what they were doing. legalchems.co.uk, plantfoodbuzz.com, research-chemicals.co.uk. The product listings were detailed, the descriptions clinical in tone, the customer reviews genuine. 1 gram, 5 grams, 10 grams, 100 grams. The quantities scaled like any other wholesale operation. Payment by credit card or bank transfer. Dispatch within 24 hours. Discreet packaging guaranteed. The only thing that distinguished these sites from any other online retailer was the small print at the bottom, which stated, with the particular confidence of a legal fiction, that everyone understands perfectly well, that the product was plant food and was not intended for human consumption. This disclaimer was the entire architecture of the business model. It was also understood, by vendors and customers alike, to be roughly as meaningful as the terms and conditions nobody reads before clicking agree. In March of 2009, there were, by most estimates, fewer than 10 vendors selling Mephedrone online in the United Kingdom. By June of the same year, there were dozens. Some of them were advertising on Google, not through the back channels of the underground internet, not through private forums or encrypted messaging, but through ordinary Google AdWords, the same system a plumber or a florist or a tutoring service might use to reach new customers. The advertisements appeared alongside serious news websites. They appeared next to search results for related topics. They appeared because the product was, legally speaking, plant food, and Google's systems had no particular reason to treat plant food advertisements as problematic. The gap between what the advertisements were selling and what Google's policy framework was designed to handle was approximately the size of a generation's weekend. The legal architecture that made this possible was a particular feature of British law at the time. The Misuse of Drugs Act prohibited specific controlled substances by name. Mephedrone was not on the list. The Medicines Act prohibited selling substances for human consumption without appropriate licensing, which was why the plant food label existed, giving vendors the defense that they were not selling anything for human consumption, and the small print was there to prove it. The resulting situation was one in which a vendor could operate entirely within the law while selling a psychoactive stimulant to anyone with a credit card and an internet connection, provided they maintained the legal fiction of the label and everyone involved understood that the fiction was a fiction and proceeded accordingly. It was, as legal arrangements go, one of the more creative ones of the early 21st century. The forum culture that surrounded it was something new. Erowid and Blue Light were the major platforms, harm reduction sites, originally, that had evolved into something closer to comprehensive drug encyclopedias, with thousands of first-person experience reports filed by users who wrote up their sessions with the seriousness of clinical case studies. Onset time, duration, dosage, effect by stage, interactions with other substances, warnings, recommendations. The data was user-generated, unverified by any official body, and considerably more useful for someone actually planning to take a substance than anything the official health information channels were producing, which tended toward the broad and the cautionary rather than the specific and the practical. For Mephedrone, the reports accumulated quickly. By the summer of 2009, there were hundreds of them, cross-referencing batches, comparing vendors, flagging quality issues with specific suppliers, discussing dosing strategies in terms that would not have been out of place in a pharmacology seminar. Users recommended particular vendors the way you might recommend a restaurant, not because the food would kill you, or because it would definitely be the best meal of your life, but because the quality was consistent and the price was honest. This was the world's first drug review ecosystem operating at scale, and it was running entirely in the open, on platforms that anyone could find with a search, in language that anyone could read. What the reports described when they got to the effects themselves was consistent across hundreds of accounts. The onset was fast, 15 to 45 minutes, taken orally, faster insufflated, though snorting it burned significantly, and most users found this deterrent enough to stay with the oral route. The peak arrived cleanly, without the gradual build of MDMA, without the sharp chemical edge of cocaine. Users described euphoria that felt reliable rather than overwhelming, less of a lurch and more of a lifting. Talkativeness arrived with it, the kind where conversation becomes effortless, and everything you think of saying seems worth saying. Empathy came next, a warmth toward the people around you that users consistently described as significant, even in cases where MDMA had long since stopped producing it. Music sounded better. Time compressed. The night that had been stretching ahead of you was suddenly 2 hours gone. The pharmacology underneath all of this is worth understanding, because it explains both why the drug worked so well and why it created the pattern of use that it did. Mephedrone acts on the same systems as MDMA and cocaine, but with a profile that sits between them. It forces the transporters that ordinarily move dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine back into neurons to run in reverse, flooding the synapses with all three simultaneously. Dopamine produces the stimulation, the motivation, the sense that whatever is happening right now is a very good idea. Serotonin produces the warmth, the sociability, the emotional openness. Norepinephrine raises heart rate and alertness and prepares everything for action. MDMA tilts heavily toward serotonin. Cocaine tilts toward dopamine. Mephedrone produced both in roughly equal measure, which is why users described it as feeling like a mixture of the two, the empathy of one, the drive of the other, arriving in the same moment. The duration was the problem. MDMA lasts 4 to 6 hours at peak. Mephedrone lasts 2 to 3. The effect was comparable in intensity, but the window in which it arrived was significantly shorter, which meant the gap at the end arrived sooner and arrived hard. When the high ends, it ends quickly. Users describe the come down as swift, leaving a vacuum behind it, a sudden contrast that made the previous hours feel further away than they were. The solution that presented itself in the moment was obvious: another dose, and another. The urge to redose was described in report after report with a consistency that amounted to a clinical finding, not just wanting more, but finding it genuinely difficult to make the decision to stop while supply remained. Clinical data would eventually put numbers to this. 47% of users reported using for 2 or more consecutive days. 30% met the criteria for dependence by formal diagnostic standards. More than half of users, in one study, rated mephedrone as more addictive than cocaine, which is a remarkable thing to find about a drug that was sold as plant food. The extreme end of the pattern appeared in Warsaw hospital records. 601 patients admitted between 2010 and 2018, following prolonged binges, with an average binge duration of 12.5 days and an average daily consumption of 1.5 grams. 12.5 days. The drug that had been described as a Friday night choice had, for a significant minority, become something that swallowed entire weeks at a stretch. The physical signs that came with heavy use were not subtle. Jaw clenching tight enough to cause lasting dental damage, heart palpitations, blue or cold fingers, peripheral vasoconstriction, the blood vessels at the extremities narrowing in response to cardiovascular strain, hypothermia in hot environments, particularly dangerous in club settings where dancing raised body temperature further, insomnia that persisted for days after the last dose, the brain unable to find its way back to normal rest. None of these were universal. At moderate doses, in otherwise healthy people, the experience was broadly what the reviews described. The risks scaled with the dose and the duration and the frequency, as they do with most things, and the compulsive quality of the redosing meant that many users found themselves at higher doses and longer durations than they had planned for. Who was using it is a question that upended the assumptions that tend to accompany stories about drug epidemics. The demographic was not the one that drug panics usually feature. Professor Judith Aldridge at the University of Manchester, studying her own student population, found that well over half of students there had tried mephedrone. The surveys that tracked it found it in universities and nightclubs and music festivals and, significantly, in rural towns and smaller cities that had never had reliable access to a drug dealer of any kind. Geography had always been one of the informal controls on drug use. You needed to be in the right place, know the right people, be part of a network that had access. Mephedrone removed geography entirely. If you had an internet connection and a postal address, you had access. Newcastle and Brighton and Birmingham and East Anglia, rural Lincolnshire and suburban Manchester, the drone revolution, as users called it, reached everywhere the postal service reached, which in the United Kingdom is everywhere. The students who ordered it in the autumn of 2009 mostly described the experience in terms of simple disbelief. You could not believe it was legal. You could not believe you did not have to get it from a dealer. You could not believe it arrived the next day in a plain packet that your housemates might easily mistake for something ordered from a normal website, because it had come from a normal website, one that accepted normal payment methods and sent normal confirmation emails, and had a normal returns policy for products that were not, of course, for human consumption. The normalcy of the transaction was the thing that kept striking people. The thing that had always been shadowy and slightly threatening, buying drugs, had been made ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was the most unsettling part because ordinary things spread. By the end of 2009, mephedrone had done something no drug had managed before. It had become genuinely popular without becoming criminal. It had spread across an entire country through a channel its users already understood. Open vendors, trackable orders, public reviews, and the legal framework that existed to stop drugs had no mechanism that applied. The Misuse of Drugs Act listed controlled substances by name. Mephedrone was not on the list. The enforcement infrastructure was built around back-alley transactions and criminal networks. This was a website with customer service hours. The tools did not fit the problem. The law moved at the speed of parliamentary process, of committee reports and readings and amendments. The drug moved at the speed of a search result. and by the time the gap between those two speeds had become impossible to ignore, a generation had already decided where it stood. The libido enhancement deserves a separate mention because it was consistently identified as one of the drug's most distinctive effects, more powerful, users reported, than MDMA, which was itself not understated in this regard. This is not a peripheral detail. The aphrodisiac quality of mephedrone shaped its later trajectory significantly. It would eventually become the dominant drug in the chemsex scene, used specifically and deliberately to facilitate extended sexual activity, with consequences for HIV and hepatitis transmission that would preoccupy public health researchers for years. In 2009, this future was not visible. What was visible was that the drug produced a kind of disinhibition and desire that users found remarkable, and that spread its reputation quickly through the networks where that particular combination of effect had obvious appeal. Sex and drugs have always shared social space. Mephedrone's particular pharmacological profile meant they shared it rather more intensely than usual. The forum community that documented all of this was doing something that had not been possible before the internet, and had never been done at this scale. Harm reduction had always relied on official sources, government websites, health charities, the sort of information produced by institutions with concerns about liability and messaging that tended to make the advice broad and the warnings prominent. What Erowid and Blue Light provided was different. First-person accounts from people who had actually taken the substance, written within hours or days of the experience, with specific details about dosing and timing, and effects that official sources either did not have or did not think appropriate to publish. The information was often better than the official alternative. It was certainly more specific. A government health website in 2009 would tell you that mephedrone was potentially dangerous and that you should not take it. A harm reduction forum would tell you the same thing, and also tell you what dose was most commonly associated with adverse effects, what combinations were particularly risky, what the early warning signs of overheating looked like, and what to do if someone near you appeared to be in trouble. The second type of information was more useful if you were going to take it anyway, which a significant proportion of the population had decided they were. The vendor side of the operation had its own particular texture. The larger sites employed customer service. There were email addresses and telephone numbers. Delivery could be tracked. Orders over a certain amount qualified for free shipping. The experience of buying mephedrone from a reputable vendor in 2009 was, in operational terms, almost indistinguishable from buying anything else online. The same sequence of confirmation emails, the same tracking number, the same plain packaging designed to arrive without comment. The difference was in the product listing, which described a white crystalline powder with a faint chemical smell, noted that it was not for human consumption, and left the rest to the reader. Most readers were not confused about what they were reading. The vendors who operated at scale were not, by most accounts, particularly reckless people. They were entrepreneurs who had identified a legal product in a legal market and built a business around it. They had customer service operations. Some had return policies. The competitive pressure among vendors created an incentive for quality. A vendor whose product was consistently impure lost customers to one whose product was not, and in a market where customers were comparing notes on public forums in real time, quality control was enforced by something very close to a consumer rating system. This, more than any official regulation, is what kept the purity at 98% during the legal period. Competition, reviews, and the knowledge that the customer would be discussing their experience publicly within hours. The geography question is worth returning to, because it changed something that had been structurally true about recreational drug use for decades. Drug markets had always been local. They depended on physical proximity, knowing someone who knew someone, being in the right city, being connected to the right network. This produced enormous variation in availability. Someone in central London had reliable access to a range of substances that someone in a small market town in Lincolnshire did not. The rural drug user's experience was defined by scarcity, by whatever happened to be available locally, by paying more for worse product from fewer sources. Mephedrone dissolved this entirely. The postal service covered the whole country. The vendor's website was equally accessible from any postcode. The price was the same in Lincolnshire as it was in London. For a population that had always been disadvantaged by geography in this particular market, the arrival of reliable next-day delivery was not a minor convenience. It was structural change. The gap, when it finally became impossible to ignore, was filled by something that was not science, and was not policy, and was not evidence. It was the tabloid press. And the tabloid press in late 2009 and into 2010 was ready for a drug story in the way that it is always ready for a drug story, with a name, a photograph, and a conclusion that did not particularly require the facts to have arrived yet. The name arrived first. Meow, meow. Nobody who used mephedrone called it meow, meow. The people who took it called it meth, or drone, or MCAT, or simply referred to it as the thing, the way you refer to something once everyone in the room already understands. The clinical designation was 4-methylmethcathinone. The street names it actually circulated under were functional and specific. Meow meow was what someone who had heard the letters MCAT decided it sounded like if you said it out loud quickly enough, and it had the distinct advantage from a headline writing perspective of being simultaneously alarming and faintly absurd. Alarming and faintly absurd is, as tabloid registers go, extremely useful. It licensed a tone of urgent disbelief that could be sustained across many front pages. Meow meow was coming. Meow meow was everywhere. Meow meow was doing things to people. The things it was doing to people, as reported, were considerable. The claim that circulated most persistently, repeated across newspapers, television news segments, radio call-in programs, and the conversations of concerned parents who had read one article and drawn what felt like the obvious conclusions, was that mephedrone caused users to pull off their own scrotums. This claim was repeated with such frequency and apparent confidence that it acquired a kind of evidential weight through sheer circulation, in the way that repeated statements tend to do. It was also, as far as anyone could subsequently determine, entirely unverified. No documented case, no hospital record, no coroner's report confirmed it. It had the specific quality of a claim that travels because it is too vivid to ignore, and too distant from ordinary experience to be easily checked. It spread the way rumours always spread, which is faster than corrections, and left a mark that corrections rarely do. The skin-scratching claims were more grounded. There were genuine reports of users scratching at their skin compulsively, of a sensation of crawling or itching that some experienced at high doses. This is a real phenomenon with stimulant drugs. Formication, it is called, and it existed with mephedrone at certain doses in certain individuals. But real and universal are not the same thing, and the coverage treated the extreme edge of high-dose adverse effects as the typical experience, which created a portrait of the drug that bore approximately the relationship to everyday use that a car crash bears to an ordinary commute. Both are real. The frequency is different. What the coverage was doing, structurally, was the same thing it always does in these moments. It was identifying a threat, assigning it a name, accumulating evidence of harm, and building toward a demand for action, all of which are functions of journalism and all of which in isolation are reasonable. The problem was the speed. The toxicology on the deaths being attributed to mephedrone had not come back. The scientific assessment of the drug's actual risk profile had barely begun. The name that was being used was not the name users used. The effects being described were at the extreme end of reported experience rather than the centre. None of this slowed anything down, because the machinery of moral panic does not require accuracy to operate. It requires attention, and attention was present in extraordinary quantities. The structural problem ran deeper than any individual inaccuracy. What was happening in late 2009 was that the association between mephedrone and harm was being established in the public mind before the science had produced evidence sufficient to confirm it. This is not unusual in drug panics. It is in fact one of their defining characteristics. The narrative precedes the evidence, and once the narrative is established, the evidence that arrives later is filtered through it. Findings that confirm the story are amplified. Findings that complicate or contradict it receive less attention, are published later, are processed by a public that has already formed its view. By the time the facts arrived, the facts would be competing with a story that had been running for months, and stories that have been running for months tend to win. The first specific death attributed to mephedrone in the British press arrived in November of 2009. Gabrielle Price was 14 years old. She died in Brighton, and Sussex police announced that they believed her death might be linked to mephedrone. The coverage was immediate and extensive. A 14-year-old girl was dead, the drug was named, and the combination produced exactly the kind of story the media machinery was built to amplify. Meow Meow had killed a child. The calls for an immediate ban intensified. The coroner's report, published later, found that Gabrielle Price had died from bronchial pneumonia. Not mephedrone. Not any drug toxicity. Bronchial pneumonia, a natural cause. Mephedrone was not involved in her death. This finding received coverage, but it received it quietly, in smaller articles, positioned without the urgency of the original story. The correction does not generate the same headlines as the accusation. It never does. The original story had run across front pages. The correction ran in the space where people had already moved on. The pattern was now established. A death occurs. Police announce a possible link to mephedrone. Coverage follows immediately and at volume. Toxicology later reveals the link was wrong or overstated. Coverage of that finding is minimal. Repeat. The drug accumulates a reputation for killing people. The science accumulates a more complicated picture. The reputation wins. Into this environment arrived Professor David Nutt, or rather, departed from it. Nutt had been the chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, the body whose scientific assessment was supposed to inform government decisions about drug classification. In October of 2009, he published an academic paper ranking drugs by harm. The methodology was careful, the findings were peer-reviewed, and the conclusion was, for a certain type of politician, deeply inconvenient. Alcohol and tobacco cause substantially more harm, by most measurable criteria, than a range of substances currently classified as illegal. This was not a new finding. It was consistent with a body of public health research that had been accumulating for years. What was new was a government scientist publishing it prominently and saying it clearly. Home Secretary Alan Johnson fired him. The stated reason was that Nutt had made public pronouncements that undermined government policy. The actual effect was to remove the chair of the scientific advisory body at the precise moment the scientific advisory body was being asked to assess a drug that was becoming a national story. 3 other ACMD members resigned in protest within days of Nutt's dismissal. The body that was supposed to evaluate the evidence for or against banning mephedrone had just lost 4 of its members, including its chair, in a dispute about whether scientists should be allowed to say things the government found uncomfortable. It was, as moments of institutional self-sabotage go, well-timed in the worst possible sense. Nutt did not disappear quietly. He set up an independent scientific committee, the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, which later became Drug Science, and continued to publish. He had views about mephedrone, carefully based on the available evidence, which pointed to a drug that was harmful at high doses and in vulnerable individuals, genuinely capable of dependence and requiring serious attention, but not the immediate existential threat to the nation's children that the coverage suggested. He said this. The coverage of what he said was somewhat less prominent than the coverage of Meow Meow eating people alive. The politicians, freed from the inconvenience of a scientific advisory body at full strength, moved at the speed that politicians move when the press is loud and an election is approaching. Each new death attributed to mephedrone produced a statement. Each statement demanded action. The action available was a ban, and the ban required the ACMD to make a recommendation. The ACMD depleted and under pressure, was working on it. The media was not working on anything. The media had already decided. By late 2009, the coverage had found its shape and was settled into it comfortably. Meow. Meow was the new thing that was killing the young. It was legal, which made its danger somehow worse. The illegality of other drugs was part of what made them feel controllable, categorized, held at a formal distance by the law, and mephedrone's legal status felt like a failure of that system, a gap that should not exist and whose existence was itself threatening. It was cheap, which made it accessible in ways that traditional drugs were not. It was ordered online, which put it beyond the geographic and social controls that had always provided some friction in the drug market. Everything about it was the wrong kind of modern. The corrective voices were present. Scientists, harm reduction specialists and criminologists who had been studying drug markets for years were saying, repeatedly, that the panic was disproportionate, that the causal links between mephedrone and specific deaths were not established, that the appropriate response was assessment rather than emergency action. They were saying it in journals and in interviews and in submissions to government committees. They were saying it while the front pages were running photographs of teenagers under headlines that had not waited for the toxicology. A ban was coming. It had been coming since the moment the tabloids found the name Meow Meow and decided it was the right name for the right story at the right time. By early March of 2010, the outcome was already decided. Mephedrone was a killer. It was meow meow. It was coming for the children. The only thing missing was a death dramatic enough to make the ban politically unavoidable, the kind that arrives with enough force that any politician who hesitates is a politician who is explaining themselves on the evening news. On the 15th of March, 2010, it arrived. Or at least, something arrived. The details would take a little longer. The legal status was the thing that seemed to drive the coverage to a particular pitch of outrage that might not have been reached if the drug had simply been illegal from the start. Illegal drugs occupied a familiar moral space in the tabloid imagination. They were dangerous, they were criminal, they were controlled, and the story of someone harmed by them was a story about the failure of individuals to obey rules that existed for their protection. Mephedrone did not fit this frame at all. It was legal. It was sold by businesses. It was marketed with disclaimers that everyone agreed were fiction. And this felt to a certain constituency of commentators and politicians like an affront to the proper order of things. Not just dangerous, but wrongly legal, which was somehow more disturbing than straightforwardly illegal. The system was supposed to prevent this. The fact that the system had not prevented it meant the system had failed, and the failure needed to be addressed urgently. And addressing it urgently meant banning the drug, and banning it quickly enough that no one could be accused of having hesitated. The Daily Mail's coverage set a particular tone early and sustained it. The Sun followed closely. Between them they produced a version of the mephedrone story that was consistent, vivid, and largely disconnected from the clinical literature that was beginning to accumulate about the drug's actual risk profile. The clinical literature described a drug that produced dependence in a significant minority of users, that carried real cardiac and psychiatric risks at high doses, that had genuine potential for harm, particularly in vulnerable individuals, and that deserved serious regulatory attention. None of this was false. The coverage described a drug that made people tear themselves apart, that killed teenagers on Friday nights, that was spreading unchecked because of a legal loophole that cynical vendors were exploiting to poison the country's youth. Some of this was also not entirely false. The overall picture the coverage created bore only a glancing relationship to the evidence. The politicians who weighed in were not by and large behaving differently from how politicians behave when a tabloid campaign is running at full volume in an election year. The general election was coming in the spring of 2010. The Labour government, already struggling in the polls, was not in a position to be seen as soft on something the newspapers were calling a killer drug. The Conservatives were not going to offer them the opportunity. The Liberal Democrats were, as is traditional in British politics, saying sensible things that nobody particularly wanted to hear. Each death attributed to Mephedrone produced a statement from the Home Office. Each statement committed to action. Action meant a ban. A ban meant the ACMD had to produce a recommendation, and the ACMD had to produce it quickly, under political pressure, with 4 fewer members than it had had 3 months earlier. The irony of the nut situation operated at several levels simultaneously. The government had fired its chief drug science advisor because he had said something inconvenient about relative drug harms. It had done this, in part to protect its policy positions on drug classification from being complicated by evidence. It had then found itself in the position of urgently needing a scientific assessment of a drug whose classification was under intense political pressure from a body that was now smaller, less experienced, and visibly aware that saying inconvenient things about drug harms had professional consequences. The environment in which the ACMD was being asked to make a recommendation about Mephedrone was one that had been shaped, in part by the government's earlier decision to make clear that scientific advisors who said inconvenient things would be removed. Whether this affected the recommendation the ACMD eventually made is a question that the people who made it have disputed. That the environment existed is not in dispute. The coverage also performed a function that coverage always performs in these situations, which is to create the impression that something must be done and must be done now. The rhythm of tabloid coverage is not the rhythm of scientific assessment. A newspaper runs a story today, follows it tomorrow, escalates the week after. A scientific body assembles evidence over months, considers it carefully, publishes findings with appropriate caveats. These two timelines do not align, and when they are forced into competition, the newspaper's timeline tends to set the pace. By the time the ACMD had assembled enough evidence to say something careful and qualified about Mephedrone's risks, the newspapers had been saying something loud and unqualified about those risks for several months. The loud and unqualified version had shaped public expectations about what the careful and qualified version should say. A recommendation for caution and further study would have felt, in that environment, like a failure of nerve. The political pressure was not for caution, it was for action. What action looked like, specifically, was a Class B classification under the Misuse of Drugs Act. The same category as cannabis and amphetamines, the level below Class A heroin and cocaine. This meant possession would carry a sentence of up to 5 years and supply up to 14. It was a significant legal response to a drug that, at the time the discussion was happening, had been definitively linked to a total of 1 confirmed death in the world, a woman in Sweden, as documented by the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. 1 death. The coverage had attached it to dozens. The science had attached it to 1. The distinction between what the science said and what the coverage said would have mattered more if the mechanism for translating science into policy had been functioning normally. It was not functioning normally. The ACMD was working under time pressure, under political pressure, and under the shadow of having just watched its chair removed for saying something the government did not like. The scientists on it were trying to do their job. The conditions under which they were doing it were not designed for careful deliberation. They were designed for speed. By early March of 2010, the story was settled. Mephedrone was meow meow. It was the drug that killed teenagers. It was coming and the government needed to stop it. The scientific assessment was incomplete. The toxicology on the most prominent deaths was pending. The ACMD was preparing a recommendation that everyone understood the government had already decided to follow. The only question was the timing, and the timing was about to be resolved by events in Scunthorpe. Louis Wainwright was 18 years old. He worked as an apprentice welder. On the evening of the 15th of March 2010, he went out in Scunthorpe with friends. Nicholas Smith was 19, a trainee chef at a well-regarded restaurant called Wintringham Fields. He went out the same night. By the morning of the 16th, both of them were dead. These are the facts that are not in dispute. 2 young men, a night out, and then nothing. Whatever happened between those 2 facts is the story that Humberside Police would attempt to tell at a press conference, and that the British media would amplify into a national emergency. and that the government would act upon within 2 weeks, and that toxicology would quietly, inconveniently, subsequently correct. Humberside Police held their press conference shortly after the deaths. They had, they said, information to suggest that the deaths were linked to MCAT. They did not say this as a confirmed finding, they said it as information, which is a word that carries less weight than evidence but considerably more than nothing, and in the climate that had been building through late 2009 and into early 2010, in the context of a media that had been running meow meow stories for months, and a public that had absorbed them, it was enough. The police statement advised anyone who had taken the drug to attend a local hospital as a matter of urgency. 4 people were arrested on suspicion of supplying a controlled drug. The press conference ended. The story began. The Sun ran it prominently. National broadcasters picked it up. By the afternoon of the 16th, the story was on front pages and leading bulletins. 2 teenagers dead after taking meow meow. The drug that had been building toward this moment in the tabloid coverage for months had now apparently delivered it. Members of Parliament made statements. The Home Office said it was taking the matter seriously. Head teachers wrote to newspapers. Community leaders expressed concern. The machinery of public outrage, which requires a confirmed outrage-generating event and then runs largely on its own momentum, was running. What the machinery did not particularly require, and did not particularly wait for, was the toxicology. Toxicology takes time. Bodies need to be examined by pathologists. Samples need to be sent to laboratories. Results need to be returned and interpreted and incorporated into a coroner's report. This process, done properly, takes weeks. The press conference happened on the 16th of March. The ban was announced on the 30th. The toxicology was not complete. Nobody in the room where the ban was announced had seen the results. Nobody had seen the results, because the results did not yet exist. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs met on the 29th of March. They had been working on a Mephedrone assessment for some time, in the aftermath of the nut dismissal, with a depleted membership, under time pressure, and now under the specific and acute pressure of 2 deaths that the police had linked to the drug, and the media had confirmed were linked to the drug, and the public had understood to be linked to the drug. The ACMD's role was to provide scientific advice. The advice they provided on the 29th was that mephedrone was likely to be harmful and should be classified as Class B. The word likely is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Likely is not confirmed. Likely is a probabilistic statement, not a finding. The toxicology on the deaths that had precipitated the meeting was not yet complete. Home Secretary Alan Johnson announced the ban the following day. Mephedrone and a range of related cathinone compounds would be classified as Class B substances under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Possession would carry a maximum sentence of 5 years. Supply would carry a maximum of 14. The legal market that had operated openly for years, the websites, the next-day delivery, the plant food labels, the credit card transactions, would close. The ban would take effect in April. 2 members of the ACMD resigned in protest. Dr. Polly Taylor had been chairing the council's working group on mephedrone. She resigned. Dr. Les King, also a committee member, resigned. 2 scientists who had been engaged in the process of actually assessing the evidence left the body that was supposed to assess the evidence at the moment the assessment was being used to justify a classification because they did not believe the process had been sound. The Lancet, one of the oldest and most respected medical journals in the world, published a warning that politics had contaminated the scientific appraisal of mephedrone. These were not small objections from marginal figures. They were formal resignations and an editorial in a major medical journal, issued at the moment the ban was announced. The coverage of the resignations was considerably less prominent than the coverage of the ban. Mephedrone became Class B in April of 2010. The legal market ceased to exist, replaced by the street dealer networks that had always run alongside it, and that were now the only source remaining for a drug that, as would shortly become apparent, several 100,000 people still wanted. In May of 2010, the toxicology results on Louis Wainwright and Nicholas Smith came back. There was no mephedrone in their blood. Neither of them had taken it. The post-mortem examinations, completed in the weeks after the press conference that had described their deaths as linked to MCAT, found no trace of mephedrone in either body. What they found instead was alcohol and methadone. Methadone, a heroin substitute, used in addiction treatment, a controlled drug that had been in regulated medical use for decades and had nothing at all to do with the substance that had just been banned in a national emergency. It sounds, if you say it quickly in a noisy room, a little like mephedrone. That is, as explanations go, one of the thinner threads on which a ban has ever been hung. Detective Chief Inspector Mark Oliver, who had led the initial Humberside police investigation, told the subsequent inquest that the force had no evidence or information that Louis Wainwright had ever or did on that night take mephedrone. He said he did not regret making the public link at the time. He said the force had given out a message that those two young men had taken drugs known locally as MCAT. Whether that was mephedrone or not was not something he could say. He had said it was linked to MCAT. He had not confirmed it was mephedrone. The distinction, at a press conference attended by journalists who were filing stories about Meow Meow Kills 2, was not one that had survived transmission. Professor David Nutt, the scientist who had been fired from the ACMD for saying inconvenient things about drug harms, called for an inquiry into Humberside Police's handling of the press conference. Professor Roman Sedefov, who monitored new drugs for the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, stated that at the time of the UK ban, he had been aware of a total of 1 fatality in the world where mephedrone had been definitively identified as the cause of death. 1. The coverage of the time of the ban had attached it to dozens. The media coverage of the toxicology findings was quiet. Not absent. The story appeared in the newspapers, in the broadcasters. But it appeared in the way that corrections appear, which is smaller and later, and in a position that does not suggest urgency. The front pages that had run Meow Meow Kills 2 did not run Meow Meow Did Not Kill 2 at corresponding size and prominence. The story that had driven a ban did not unspool into a reconsideration of the ban. The ban was law. It stayed law. The correction was noted and moved past, which is how most corrections are handled, and is, as processes go, one of the more reliable ways of ensuring that the original impression survives the correction intact. What remained, when the noise settled, was a law built on deaths that the drug had not caused, passed faster than the evidence could travel, by a scientific body that had resigned 2 of its members in protest at the process, and condemned by one of the leading medical journals as politically contaminated. These are not the normal conditions for good legislation. They are, however, recognisable conditions for legislation that reflects the speed of a tabloid campaign, rather than the speed of a scientific assessment, which are very different speeds, and which produce very different kinds of law. The government had banned a drug. It just hadn't banned it because of the thing everyone said it had banned it for. Wainwright and Smith hadn't taken mephedrone. Nobody in authority had waited to find out. And somewhere in that gap, between the press conference and the toxicology, between the panic and the facts, a law was made. The kind that tends to stick even after the reason for making it has quietly disappeared. The actual mephedrone deaths, the ones that could be confirmed by toxicology, that met the evidentiary standard that the Scunthorpe deaths did not, existed but were not the ones that drove the ban. In Scotland, 2 people had died with mephedrone confirmed in their blood at concentration sufficient to establish intoxication as the cause. The first confirmed death attributed to mephedrone in the UK was a 46-year-old man named John Sterling Smith, who had underlying health conditions and who had been repeatedly injecting the drug, a route of administration that produces a significantly more intense and more dangerous experience than oral consumption, and one that the research would later show carried substantially higher risk. These deaths were real. They were documented. They were, by the standard of evidence, the strongest case that mephedrone could cause fatal harm. They were also not the cases anyone was talking about. The cases everyone was talking about were Wainwright and Smith in Scunthorpe, and Gabriel Price before them. These were the cases that had generated the headlines and the demands for action and the parliamentary statements. They were the cases that had made mephedrone a national story rather than a concerning new substance known to harm reduction specialists. And they were the cases that, when the science arrived, had nothing to do with mephedrone. The drug's actual victims were real, and their deaths were real, but they were not famous, and the drug's alleged victims were famous, and the famous ones were the ones who mattered to the political timeline. The speed at which the ban moved through the system is worth dwelling on because it is, in the context of how drug policy normally operates, remarkable. The ACMD's guidelines for assessing a new substance involved a process of evidence gathering, expert consultation, formal review, and recommendation that was designed to take months. The assessment of mephedrone had been underway since the previous year, was already running behind schedule partly because of the nut dismissal, and was completed under acute political pressure in the weeks following the Scunthorpe press conference. The recommendation arrived on the 29th of March. The announcement came on the 30th. The legislation was put before Parliament and passed, from press conference to law in roughly 6 weeks. 6 weeks, in the context of how drug classification normally works in the United Kingdom, is extraordinarily fast. The process that preceded it, the ACMD assessment, the consultation, the deliberation, is supposed to take long enough for the evidence to actually arrive and be evaluated. What happened instead was that the process was completed to a timeline set by a media campaign rather than an evidence base, with a depleted committee, with the toxicology on the most prominent attributed deaths still pending, and with 2 committee members resigning in protest on the day the recommendation was published. The official recommendation was that mephedrone was likely to be harmful. Likely. That word was chosen carefully. It reflects the state of the evidence at the time, not confirmed harm at the scale the coverage suggested, but enough concern based on available data to justify classification. Whether that evidence, assessed calmly and without the pressure of a national emergency, would have produced the same recommendation on the same timeline is a question that cannot now be answered. The Lancet's editorial was direct. It described the ban as contaminated by politics. It said that the scientific process had been compromised by political pressure, and that the result was a classification that reflected the urgency of a tabloid campaign more than the weight of the evidence. The Lancet is not a polemical publication. It does not use language like contaminated lightly. The editorial was a formal statement by one of the world's most respected scientific journals that the British government had made a drug policy decision in bad faith. The coverage of the editorial was not proportionate to the coverage of the press conference that had preceded it. The inquest into Louis Wainwright's death, held months later when the facts were available, was notable for what it found, and for the response of the officer who had made the public link. The inquest heard that Wainwright had been so intoxicated by the combination of alcohol and methadone that friends had to help him home, and that CCTV operators had called police and paramedics to check on him earlier in the evening. He went home. He did not wake up. The coroner recorded accidental death from the combination of alcohol and methadone. The inquest into Nicholas Smith's death found the same cause. Methadone and alcohol. No mephedrone. Detective Chief Inspector Oliver's position at the inquest, that he did not regret the original press conference statement, reflects a particular institutional logic that is worth understanding. The police had information that the 2 men had tried to buy MCAT during the evening. They had not been able to confirm whether they had succeeded. They had not waited for toxicology. They had held a press conference describing the deaths as linked to MCAT because they had information suggesting they were linked to MCAT, and that information had turned out to be wrong. But the press conference had already happened, and the ban had already happened, and the law had already changed, and it was at that point difficult to see what purpose revisiting any of it would serve. This is institutional logic. It is not the same as good reasoning. It is, however, how institutions tend to respond when they have made a consequential error and the consequences cannot be reversed. What the ban changed, immediately and practically, was the supply chain. The legal market that had operated openly for years was gone. The websites came down, the packets stopped. The price, which had been £10 a gram at purity of 98%, became the problem of whoever was supplying it illegally, and illegal suppliers work on different economics than legal ones. The price doubled within weeks. The purity collapsed from 98% to 37%, because the absence of commercial competition and consumer review culture meant there was no longer any market incentive to maintain quality. What had been a pure product in plain packaging became an adulterated one in whatever packaging was available. The substance was now cut with monosodium glutamate, caffeine, creatine, benzocaine, whatever made the weight right and the cost lower. 3 months after the ban, in July of 2010, researchers published a study conducted across 2 London nightclubs. The study found that mephedrone was more popular than any other drug present. 27% of the people surveyed had either taken it that night or were intending to. The drug had been banned in April. It was July. It was still the most popular drug in the room, at double the price and less than half the purity. The ban had not reduced demand. It had transferred the supply from legal vendors who accepted Visa to illegal dealers who did not, and in doing so had made the product more expensive, less pure and more dangerous, while leaving the demand exactly where it had been. The correction to the Scunthorpe story, the finding that Wainwright and Smith had not taken mephedrone, arrived in May. The ban had been law since April. The law would remain. The correction would not unmake it. This is, in the mechanics of legislation, how it works. A law passed is a law passed. The facts that justified its passage are not reviewed after the fact. The process that produced it is not recalled because the evidence that drove it turns out to have been wrong. The law is simply there, operating in the world, doing what laws do, regardless of whether the deaths it was passed to prevent were caused by the thing it was passed to ban. There is something particular about that gap, between the press conference and the toxicology, between the urgency and the evidence, that is not unique to mephedrone. Drug panics are made of that gap. They have always been made of it. What was different here, what gives this one its particular texture, is the precision of the error. Not a drug that was generally considered dangerous and turned out to be less dangerous than feared. A drug that was definitively linked to specific deaths, named in police statements, confirmed by tabloid coverage, acted upon by Parliament, and then found by the science that arrived after all of that to have had nothing to do with those specific deaths at all. The gap was not vague. It had names: Louis Wainwright, Nicholas Smith. It had a date, the 15th of March, 2010. It had location, Scunthorpe, and it closed in May with a toxicology report that nobody on the front page particularly wanted to discuss. The ban did not reduce demand. This is not a controversial finding. It is a documented one, measurable, and it arrived quickly enough that anyone paying attention could have read it as a result rather than a prediction. Within 3 months, the drug was still the most popular substance in certain London nightclubs. Within 3 years, the United Nations had produced a report stating that the United Kingdom remained Europe's largest mephedrone market. Use had increased by 300% since the criminalisation. 300%. The drug that had been banned in a national emergency, on the basis of deaths it had not caused, under political pressure that had depleted the scientific advisory body meant to assess it, had tripled in prevalence in the 3 years following the ban. The Home Office's own statistics for 2013 and 14 found that approximately 1.4 million people aged between 16 and 59 had tried mephedrone at least once, 250,000 more than the equivalent figure from the year before. These numbers contain a lesson that drug policy has been taught repeatedly, and has repeatedly declined to learn, which is that banning a substance does not eliminate demand for it, and may not reduce supply. What it does, reliably, is change the conditions under which the supply is produced and distributed. In the case of mephedrone, those conditions changed in every direction that made the drug more dangerous. The price kept rising. The purity kept falling. The adulteration had no market correction mechanism. When customers were buying from street dealers rather than reviewing vendors on public forums, there was no feedback loop. There was no review to leave. There was no competitor vendor to switch to. There was just the dealer and whatever was in the packet. The generation that had grown up ordering from websites and comparing batches on forums was now buying from whoever they could find, at prices that had increased and purities that had dropped, with no way to verify what they were getting beyond the kind of faith that the old drug market had always required, and that the new one had so briefly made unnecessary. The specific thing that had made Mephedrone's legal period relatively safe, the transparency, the competition, the review culture, was gone. What remained was demand and supply, and the gap between them filled by people who had no particular incentive to maintain quality. The chemistry community that had produced Mephedrone did not stop because Mephedrone was banned. It accelerated. The pattern that had always operated in the research chemical world, make a compound, circulate it, get it banned, adjust the molecular structure by a fraction, start again, suddenly had a very large audience and a very clear commercial incentive. The people who had been running the legal Mephedrone market needed new products. The underground chemists who had been exploring cathinone derivatives on forums for years had synthesis routes. The two groups found each other quickly, because the internet had been connecting them for a decade already. Within weeks of the ban, new compounds began appearing. NRG1, marketed as a Mephedrone replacement, turned out to contain nephyrone, itself banned shortly after. Ivory Wave, another claimed replacement, was found to contain MDPV, a cathinone derivative with a profile that users and clinicians found significantly more alarming than Mephedrone. The products were not tested. The effects were not known in advance. The only thing that had been tested was the legal status. Each new compound had been designed to exist in a gap in the legislation, sold as legal until it was scheduled, then replaced by the next variation. The arms race between underground chemists and legislative schedules, which had always been a feature of the research chemical world, was now running at commercial scale, with a mass market of users who had been primed by Mephedrone to expect legal highs to be available, effective, and purchasable without criminal risk. By 2016, the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction was tracking more than 620 novel psychoactive substances, 620 compounds that had not existed as commercial recreational products before the Mephedrone era. Most of them created in response to specific bans, each filling the gap left by its predecessor before, being banned and replaced in turn. The molecular arms race produced compounds of increasingly unpredictable character, because the further you moved from the well-studied core structures, the less you knew about what the effects would be, and the less existing research there was to draw on. Mephedrone, with its specific and well-documented profile, was replaced by substances whose profiles were not documented, and whose effects were being discovered in real time by the people taking them. The British government's eventual response to this proliferation was the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016, a blanket ban on all novel psychoactive substances, covering any compound capable of producing a psychoactive effect except those specifically exempted, which included alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. This was, as legislative approaches go, ambitious to the point of incoherence. Experts noted immediately that it was essentially unenforceable, that the definition of psychoactive was broad enough to cover nutmeg and morning glory seeds, and a significant portion of the herbal tea aisle, and that the compounds it was designed to restrict would continue to be available online from international vendors who were outside British jurisdiction. The law was passed regardless. Whether it reduced harm is a question that continues to be studied. Whether it reduced the availability of novel psychoactive substances is a question with a more straightforward answer, which is not particularly. The online drug trade is the larger legacy, and it is the one that expanded beyond anything Mephedrone's original vendors had imagined. The model that those vendors had proved, order online, pay by card, receive by post, verify quality through reviews, was adopted, adapted, and extended into darker territory. Silk Road launched in February of 2011, approximately 10 months after the Mephedrone ban. It used Tor for anonymity and Bitcoin for payment, adding layers of obfuscation that the Mephedrone sites had not required because they had not needed them. They had been operating legally. Silk Road was not operating legally, but it was using infrastructure, habits, and expectations that the legal Mephedrone market had established. The idea that drugs could be purchased online with the same consumer expectations that governed other online commerce — reliability, reviews, quality control, buyer protection — had been normalized by Mephedrone in the years when it was legal. Silk Road took that normalized expectation and extended it into the illegal market. The connection is not simply chronological. The Mephedrone generation had learned that buying drugs online was normal, that quality could be assessed through reviews, that delivery was reliable and discreet, that the transaction did not require a dangerous human interaction. When Mephedrone was banned and the legal sites closed, a portion of those users looked for alternatives that provided the same experience through different means. The darknet markets that emerged in the following years were not building something entirely new. They were building on something that already existed in people's expectations and habits, established during the years when the whole thing had been entirely legal and entirely ordinary. The 4.4% figure from the British Crime Survey of 2011 is worth pausing on. 4.4% of adults aged 16 to 24 in England and Wales reported having used Mephedrone in the previous year. That rate, 1 in roughly 23 young adults, was comparable to the cocaine use rate for the same age group. A drug that had not existed as a mainstream recreational substance 18 months earlier had, in the period following its ban, achieved a prevalence rate among young people equivalent to one of the most established illegal drugs in the country. The ban had been intended to drive that number towards zero. It had instead produced a number that invited comparison to cocaine, which had been illegal for decades and which the full machinery of drug enforcement had been applied to throughout that period. The economics of the underground market help explain why demand was so resistant to the ban. In the legal period, the margin between cost and retail price had been extraordinary. Kilograms synthesized for hundreds of pounds, sold at tens of thousands. That margin had existed because there was no criminal risk premium. Once the drug was illegal, the risk premium appeared. Dealers needed to be compensated for the legal danger of handling a controlled substance. The costs of operation increased. The price passed to the consumer increased. But the demand had been established at a scale, by a generation that had grown accustomed to the product's existence, that did not respond proportionately to a price increase. The demand was relatively inelastic, because the drug had been embedded in social patterns and habits during the years when it was freely available, and those patterns did not dissolve when the price went up. The transition from legal vendor to street dealer also changed the geography in ways that reversed the gains of the legal period. The postal market had dissolved geography. Rural users had the same access as urban ones. Scotland had the same access as London. The street market restored geography as a constraint. You needed to know a dealer. You needed to be in a place where dealers operated. The rural teenager who had been ordering from a website now had no reliable source, unless someone in their network happened to know someone who could supply. The urban clubber in a city with an established drug scene adapted more easily. The inequality of access that the internet market had briefly eliminated was reinstated, unevenly and incompletely, by the return to physical distribution. What happened to the specific NPS compounds that followed Mephedrone illustrates the futility of the molecular arms race more clearly than any policy argument could. Napherone, sold as NRG1 and marketed explicitly as a legal Mephedrone replacement, was banned within months of appearing. The people who had bought it reported effects that were recognisably cathinone-like, but with a rougher, more unpredictable character, the product of chemistry that had been optimised for legal status rather than effect profile. MDPV, found in ivory wave products, produced paranoia and agitation at doses that mephedrone at equivalent weight would not have approached. Users who had calibrated their consumption to mephedrone's known profile found that the replacements did not behave the same way, and the consequences of that miscalibration appeared in emergency room presentations across the country. Alpha PVP, another cathinone derivative that became prominent in the NPS wave, was associated with behavioural effects so extreme that it generated its own media panic years after mephedrones. Reports from the United States described users in states of psychotic agitation that bore no resemblance to mephedrone's relatively sociable profile. The drugs were chemically related but experientially distant, connected by the legislation that had banned the parent compound and the commercial logic that had produced the successors. Each ban created the conditions for a replacement that was less well understood, less stable in its effects, and less amenable to the kind of user-generated quality control that the mephedrone era had briefly established. 3-MMC, 3-methylmethcathinone, a structural isomer of mephedrone with the methyl group shifted one position, emerged as perhaps the most direct successor. It was chemically nearly identical to mephedrone, but sufficiently different to avoid the specific scheduling that covered mephedrone. It became popular in Europe in the years following mephedrone's ban, particularly in France and the Netherlands, carrying a broadly similar effect profile and attracting a broadly similar user population. It was banned in France in 2022, 12 years after mephedrone, following a trajectory that was almost exactly parallel. A compound appears, achieves popularity, generates harm concerns, attracts regulatory attention, is banned. The gap it leaves is filled by the next variation, and the cycle continues. The Silk Road story is, in retrospect, impossible to fully separate from mephedrones. Ross Ulbricht, who built and operated the marketplace, launched it in February of 2011. 9 months after the mephedrone ban had created a population of drug buyers who were accustomed to online purchasing and were now looking for alternatives to the legal market that had closed. Silk Road used Tor for anonymity and Bitcoin for payment, both of which were technically sophisticated but not conceptually new to the population it was targeting. The concept, browse listings, read reviews, pay, receive, was identical to the legal mephedrone experience. The technology that obscured it was different. The expectation it was built on was the same. Ulbricht was arrested in 2013. The marketplace that followed his, Agora, Alphabay, Hansa, and dozens of others, operated on the same model and served the same population, which by then had been buying drugs online, one way or another, for the better part of a decade. The war on drugs had, through a series of individually defensible decisions, constructed an outcome that none of its architects would have chosen. The Cambodia seizure had broken the MDMA market. The broken MDMA market had created the vacuum that mephedrone filled. Mephedrone's rise had created the legal online drug market. The legal online drug market had been banned in a panic over deaths it had not caused. The ban had tripled use, collapsed purity, and triggered the NPS explosion. The NPS explosion had produced compounds more dangerous than the one it replaced. The model the legal market had established had been absorbed into the darknet, where it continued to function at scale, beyond the reach of the legislative tools that had been designed for a different era. Somewhere in a Chinese laboratory, the next compound was already being synthesized. The only question was what name it would be given, and how long before someone put it in a packet labelled not for human consumption, and how long after that before the whole thing began again. The compound adapted. That is the thing about chemistry. The molecule does not respond to legislation. It continues to exist in the same configuration regardless of what Parliament decides about it, available to anyone with a synthesis route in a laboratory, waiting in the space between what is prohibited and what has been thought to prohibit. What the ban changed was the population that used it, and the geography in which it circulated, not the compound itself. In Britain, the mass market phase ended. The university students who had ordered it in the autumn of 2009, who had found it on the doorstep the following morning, and passed it around and gone out on Friday and sometimes come home on Monday, moved on. MDMA was returning. From 2013 onward, a new synthesis route that bypassed the safrole restriction began producing MDMA at scale again, and the ecstasy market that had collapsed in the years before mephedrone's rise began to recover. Pills climbed back toward meaningful MDMA content. The original reason for switching to mephedrone, that the alternative had stopped being the alternative, was slowly dissolving. The students who had grown up on the mephedrone market graduated, moved into their mid-20s, and found that something closer to what they had originally wanted was available again. Many of them returned to it. By 2018, mephedrone use in England and Wales had fallen to 0.1% of the population, from the fourth most popular drug to a statistical footnote in less than a decade. But 0.1% of the population of England and Wales is still roughly 500,000 people, and the populations that remained were not the ones who had used it casually and moved on. They were the ones for whom the alternatives were less available, the ones for whom the specific qualities of mephedrone, the intensity, the cost, the particular pharmacological combination, had met needs that other substances did not. The street homeless. Long-term stimulant injectors for whom mephedrone had become part of an established pattern of use that the ban had made more dangerous but had not ended. And the Chemsex scene, which had developed a relationship with mephedrone that was specific enough and embedded enough in particular social practices that the broader market's retreat did not dislodge it. Chemsex is a word that arrived in the clinical literature around the same time mephedrone was shifting out of the mainstream, a name for the practice of combining drugs with extended sexual activity, predominantly in networks of gay and bisexual men, in sessions that could last for days. The drugs involved varied. GHB, crystal methamphetamine, and mephedrone were the most common combination, each serving a different function in a pharmacological arrangement that users had developed through experience rather than design. Mephedrone's role was specific. Its libido enhancement, consistently described by users as among the most powerful of any drug in its class, stronger than MDMA in this particular respect, combined with its stimulant properties to produce a state of sustained arousal and energy that the session required. At lower doses, sustained over hours rather than consumed in a single large amount, it could be titrated through a long night in ways that other stimulants made more difficult. The human cost of the Chemsex scene was documented through the clinical literature over the following years with a clarity that made uncomfortable reading. HIV and hepatitis C transmission, linked to needle sharing within Chemsex sessions, appeared in hospital data. Psychiatric presentations from extended mephedrone binges, psychosis, severe depression, the kind of neurological disruption that follows sustained interference with dopamine and serotonin systems, required clinical management that the medical infrastructure was not initially designed to handle, because the patient population and the specific substance were both relatively new. The sessions that users described bore no resemblance to the Friday night social drug use of the university era. They were longer, more intense, more isolated, more likely to involve injection, and more likely to end in circumstances that required medical intervention. What drove the Chemsex scene was not simply pharmacology. The people who described why mephedrone specifically had become embedded in that world talked about something harder to measure. The social isolation that some gay men carried, a particular kind of loneliness that could have roots in experiences of rejection, in the background noise of homophobia, in the specific difficulty of forming the kinds of connections that others take for granted, found a chemical answer in something that produced, reliably, a sense of intimacy and desire and belonging, even if the answer was temporary and the cost was accumulating. One clinician working with that population described mephedrone as something that seemed to remedy, for a few hours, a feeling of unlovability. The pharmacology and the psychology had found each other in a population where both were present at high intensity, and the result was a pattern of use that was difficult to interrupt from the outside. Meanwhile, somewhere east of wherever the British ban had reached, the compound was finding new ground. Eastern Europe had always been different terrain. Cocaine was expensive and often unavailable, its supply chains less established than in Western Europe, where the routes from South America had been running for decades. The recreational drug landscape was shaped by what was available: amphetamines, synthetic cathinones, substances that could be produced locally or imported cheaply from the chemical supply chains running through China and India. Mephedrone fitted this landscape naturally. It was cheap to produce. It was potent. It had the stimulant profile that recreational users in Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary and Slovakia were accustomed to seeking. And it had the internet, which did not stop at national borders. Poland became one of the significant early markets. The cathinone that had made its name in British nightclubs found a second audience among users who had no particular relationship to the British story and no particular awareness of the panic that had surrounded it. For them, mephedrone was simply the best available option in a market where the best available options had changed since the international drug enforcement efforts of the preceding decade had disrupted supply chains across the continent. Russia was different again, and the scale of what happened there exceeded anything that had occurred in Britain at the peak of the legal period. By the mid-2010s, mephedrone had become one of the most popular recreational drugs in the country. The structural conditions that had enabled its rise in Britain — weak cocaine market, strong appetite for stimulants, established internet infrastructure — were all present in more extreme form. Cocaine was a luxury in Russia, in a way it had not been in Britain, prohibitively expensive for most recreational drug users. The internet infrastructure that supported darknet markets was, if anything, more developed in certain Russian cities than in the UK. And enforcement, while severe in the abstract, was applied unevenly enough that large-scale production and distribution remained viable in ways that the British market had not experienced during the legal period. The Hydra darknet marketplace became the primary distribution channel. Hydra was, by some measures, the largest darknet market in the world, not the most internationally known, but the most commercially significant for the post-Soviet space. Mephedrone was among its most traded products, moving from clandestine laboratories through a network of dead drops and anonymous transactions to a user population that was growing rather than shrinking. In January of 2020, Russian police raided a laboratory outside Moscow. They found 66 kilograms of mephedrone, 600 litres of liquid containing synthetic drugs, and enough precursor chemicals to continue production at scale. 5 people were arrested. The laboratory was not a cottage operation. It was an industrial facility dedicated to producing a substance that, in the United Kingdom where it had become famous, was by then used by less than 0.5% of the population. The divergence between the British story and the Russian one is the clearest illustration of what happens when a ban succeeds in one place and not another. In Britain, the ban reduced mainstream use, moved the drug into marginal populations, and gradually lost ground to the recovery of the substances it had replaced. In Russia, with no equivalent legal market to begin with, and no recovery of competing substances to displace, demand, the drug's trajectory continued upward through the decade following the British ban. The compound did not care about British drug policy. It continued to do what it had always done, in the bodies of people who wanted it, in whatever jurisdiction had not yet found an effective way to make it unavailable. By the early 2020s, the drug that had briefly convinced an entire generation of British students that sleep was optional had become primarily a fixture of Chemsex sessions in London and a dominant stimulant in the post-Soviet drug market. The generation it had taken over had largely moved on. The places it had migrated to had not. The internet through which it had originally spread continued to root around the obstacles placed in its way, as the internet tends to do, finding the populations and the geographies where the conditions were right and the demand was present, and the law was either absent or unenforced or both. Mephedrone did not disappear. It migrated. It changed shape, changed name, changed country. The thing that kept following it was not law enforcement or public health campaigns or political will. It was demand, unmanaged, unaddressed, quietly moving through the same channels it had always used, because the channels were still there, because the internet is still there, because the internet does not close. The MDMA recovery deserves more attention than it typically receives in the Mephedrone story, because it is the thing that most clearly reveals the contingent nature of Mephedrone's mass-market success. The drug had not conquered a generation through some intrinsic superiority. It had filled a gap. When the gap closed, when MDMA returned to meaningful purity in the ecstasy pills that had spent several years containing everything except ecstasy, began containing it again. The generation that had used Mephedrone as a substitute largely stopped using Mephedrone and returned to the original. The loyalty, such as it was, had been to the effect rather than to the compound. The compound that most reliably delivered the effect at any given moment was the compound that won the market, and from 2013 onward, that compound was increasingly MDMA again. This transition happened unevenly and over time. There was no single moment when the Mephedrone era ended, just a slow demographic shift in who was still using it and in what context. The university population fell away first, as MDMA became available again, and the novelty of the legal high category receded. The club and festival circuit followed, its users returning to substances with longer cultural histories and more familiar risk profiles. What remained was the hard core of use, the people for whom Mephedrone had become embedded in specific practices that MDMA's return did not disrupt, because those practices had developed around Mephedrone's particular qualities rather than simply around the need for a stimulant. The clinical profile of the population presenting to addiction services with Mephedrone as the primary substance shifted accordingly. In the early years following the ban, presentations had included a wide range of users, students, clubbers, people who had simply used it recreationally and found they could not stop as easily as they had expected. By the mid-2010s, the population coming through addiction services was increasingly composed of long-term injectors, Chemsex participants experiencing severe psychiatric consequences, and people whose Mephedrone use had become entangled with homelessness, poverty, and multiple other health conditions. The drug that had briefly been the ordinary recreational choice of an ordinary recreational population had become associated primarily with populations experiencing significant social disadvantage, which is the trajectory of almost every drug that follows a ban, not because bans change the drug, but because they change who is willing to take the risks associated with using it. The Eastern European dimension opened a parallel clinical story. In Poland, where Mephedrone became established in the early post-ban years, hospital presentations for cathinone-related psychiatric emergencies began appearing in the literature. The pattern was consistent across countries. A drug that had been used recreationally by a broad population began being used more intensively by a narrower one, with consequences that included psychosis, severe depression, and the particular neurological damage associated with prolonged high-dose stimulant use. The psychiatric ward data from Warsaw that documented 601 admissions over 8 years for prolonged Mephedrone binges was not an outlier. It was an early indicator of a pattern that would repeat across the region as the decade continued. The Russian experience was distinctive in scale and in the social organization around the drug's distribution. Hydra, the darknet marketplace that became the primary channel, operated through a system of dead drops. Packages hidden in public spaces, locations transmitted after payment, retrieved anonymously by the buyer, that the Russian drug enforcement environment had effectively encouraged by making conventional in-person transactions more dangerous. The dead drop system required no human contact between buyer and seller, reducing the risk of arrest for both parties, but also removing any residual quality control that human relationships might have maintained. Users received packages of unknown exact content from vendors they would never meet, and whatever those packages contained was what they consumed. The human cost that accumulated from this system was not well documented in official statistics, partly because Russian public health data on drug use was limited, and partly because the stigma around drug use in that cultural context made both self-reporting and help-seeking less likely. What the available data showed was consistent with the worst outcomes documented elsewhere: injection-related HIV and hepatitis C transmission, severe psychiatric episodes, deaths from overdose and from the cardiovascular strain of sustained high-dose cathinone use. The drug that had been described in British tabloids as a public health emergency was, in Russia, producing a public health crisis of considerably larger scale, largely invisible to the international conversation that had been dominated by the British story. The contrast between the two trajectories, British decline, Russian growth, contains a principle that drug policy practitioners have articulated repeatedly without it particularly changing the policies. Suppressing a drug in one place does not eliminate the demand for it. It relocates the supply and, if the demand is strong enough and the alternative supply is available, it relocates the use. The world is large and the internet has no borders, and the chemistry that produces mephedrone is not difficult to learn for anyone motivated to learn it. What the British ban had achieved was a reduction in British use. What it had not achieved, and could not have achieved, was a reduction in global use, because global use is not determined by British legislation. The drug moved. What it left behind did not. What remained, after the legal market closed and the mass market phase ended, and the compound migrated to Chemsex sessions in Eastern European cities and Russian darknet markets, was a set of facts about the world that the Mephedrone episode had made visible. Not created, they had always been there, but made visible clearly and quickly enough that anyone who wanted to understand them had several years of unambiguous evidence to work from. The first was about the internet. The internet had made it possible to build a functioning commercial drug market faster than any regulatory framework could respond to it. 9 months from a handful of vendors to the 4th most popular drug in the country. No physical infrastructure, no criminal network, no existing distribution channel co-opted or corrupted. Just search results, reviews, credit card transactions, and the postal service doing what the postal service does. This had not been anticipated. Not really. The drug legislation that existed in 2009 had been designed for a market where substances moved through criminal networks, where disruption required identifying and dismantling human supply chains, where geography provided natural friction. Mephedrone had none of that friction. It moved at the speed of information, which is to say it moved at the speed of nothing anyone had planned for. The second fact was about what bans actually do, as distinct from what they are intended to do. The mephedrone ban had been enacted with the intention of reducing availability and use. What it produced within 3 years was a 300% increase in use, at lower purity, at higher price, through a supply chain that was more dangerous and less accountable than the one it replaced. This is not an unusual outcome. It is, in fact, the documented outcome of most supply-side drug enforcement, which is why the literature on the subject has been saying approximately this for several decades. The mephedrone episode added one particularly clean example to that literature, a drug with a well-documented legal period profile, whose transition to illegal status produced measurable changes in every variable, all of them in the direction of greater harm: price up, purity down, adulteration increased, quality control eliminated, supply chain transferred from taxable businesses to criminal networks, use unchanged, then increased. The third fact was about the relationship between science and politics in drug policy, and it is the most uncomfortable of the three. The ban had been enacted before the toxicology on the deaths that justified it was complete. The scientific body that was supposed to assess the evidence had lost its chair, and 3 colleagues in a dispute about whether scientists were allowed to say inconvenient things at the precise moment that assessment was required. The recommendation it produced was hedged, likely to be harmful, not confirmed as such, and the hedging was stripped away in the political communication that followed. The specific deaths that drove the political timeline were later found to have had nothing to do with the drug. 2 scientists resigned from the committee that made the recommendation, in protest at the process by which it was made. A major medical journal called the process politically contaminated. The correction to the factual record arrived after the law had already been passed, was covered minimally, and changed nothing. This sequence, rushed science, political pressure, inaccurate attribution, law passed, correction ignored, is not unique to mephedrone. It is recognizable. It has been recognized. It has been criticized, studied, documented, and then largely repeated the next time a drug became politically urgent. The mephedrone case was cleaner than most, which is why it appears in policy literature as a case study in what not to do. It has not, to any obvious degree, changed what tends to be done. There is a particular irony in the Neil Woods observation that sits at the centre of all of this. The year mephedrone was most popular, 2009, the legal year, the year of next-day delivery and 98% purity, was the only year since the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971 that cocaine-related deaths had actually fallen. Not because mephedrone was safe. It was not entirely safe. At high doses, in susceptible individuals, in prolonged binge patterns, it caused real harm. But it was less harmful than the adulterated cocaine it was replacing, available at better purity and lower price, and the people who would otherwise have bought 20% pure cocaine with 11 adulterants bought mephedrone instead, and fewer of them died. The ban ended that period of comparative safety. It did not end the demand. It restored the conditions under which the demand was met by more dangerous products at worse prices. The deaths that went down in 2009 went back up. What was lost specifically is worth naming. The legal mephedrone market had produced something that drug markets almost never produce: transparency. Vendors competed on quality, and quality was verified through a public review system. Users knew what they were getting, approximately, because the purity was high and consistent, and the information about it circulated freely. Harm reduction existed in the form of a community that had self-organized around sharing information about dosing, interactions, and adverse effects. None of this was designed. None of it was regulated. It emerged from the same commercial and community dynamics that produce quality control and consumer information in any market where customers can read reviews and choose between suppliers. When the ban transferred the market to criminal networks, all of that disappeared. The transparency went, the reviews went, the quality consistency went. What remained was the demand, and the worst version of the supply conditions for meeting it. The generation that lived through this is now, mostly, in its mid to late 30s. The students who ordered from legalchems.co.uk in 2009 are old enough to have children who will be teenagers before this decade is out. They remember a specific thing, that for a period of time a drug they used arrived by post labelled plant food, and that the fiction of the label was so thin and so universally understood that it functioned less as a deception and more as a social agreement. Everyone agreed to look at the label and not at what was in the packet. The government agreed, the vendors agreed, the payment processors agreed, Google agreed, until it didn't. And the users agreed, most enthusiastically of all, because the arrangement served them and cost nothing except the maintenance of a fiction that nobody actually believed. That agreement was not unique to mephedrone. It was the specific, localized version of a much larger agreement that societies make around things they want and do not want to acknowledge wanting. The label says one thing, everyone understands another. The gap between the label and the understanding is where enormous amounts of commerce and human behavior live, managed through the collective decision not to press the question too hard. Mephedrone made this visible because it compressed the timeline. The agreement, the scale, the collapse, the policy response, and the consequences all happened within a few years, fast enough to study as a connected sequence rather than a gradual social shift. The packet is still out there, somewhere. Not literally. The legalchems.co.uk era is long over, the domain probably pointing at something else by now, the vendors long since pivoted or prosecuted or simply moved on. But the logic of the packet persists. Someone, right now, is synthesizing a compound that exists in a legal gap. Someone is finding a name for it and a label to put on it. Someone is building the website. The packet will arrive by post, in plain packaging, and the label will say something that nobody will quite believe, and that will be the arrangement for however long it lasts before the legislation catches up, and the compound moves, and the label changes, and the whole thing begins again. This is what the Mephedrone episode established more clearly than anything before it. Not that drugs are dangerous, not that the internet is powerful. Both of those things were already known. What it established is that the gap between what the label says and what the packet contains is not a problem that legislation solves. It is a permanent feature of the landscape. It was there before the packet. It will be there after. The policy literature produced by the Mephedrone episode is extensive and largely consistent in its conclusions. Academic papers, harm reduction reports, criminological assessments, and public health analyses have all arrived at broadly the same finding. The ban was rushed. The evidence base was inadequate at the time it was enacted. The specific deaths used to justify it were later found to be unrelated to the substance, and the ban's effect on use was the opposite of its intention. This body of work exists. It has been published. It has been read by people in positions to influence drug policy. Whether it has influenced drug policy is a different question. The British government's response to the Mephedrone problem produced, eventually, the Psychoactive Substances Act. This legislation, passed in 2016, attempted to address the whack-a-mole problem that the NPS explosion had made visible. The pattern where each banned compound was replaced by a slightly different one that existed outside the specific prohibitions of the previous ban. The solution was a blanket ban on all psychoactive substances, defined broadly enough to cover anything capable of affecting mental state. Experts noted immediately that the definition was so broad it technically covered caffeine and alcohol, both of which were specifically exempted, and that it created a situation in which the same chemistry that had always been a feature of the research chemical world would continue to operate simply with less transparency about what was being sold and consumed. Whether the Act reduced harm is, several years later, an open question. Whether it reduced the availability of novel psychoactive substances is answered more clearly by the data on hospital presentations and darknet market listings, which did not decline in the way the legislation intended. The Mephedrone story sits in a longer history of drug panics that follows a recognisable shape. A substance appears. It is new, or newly discovered by a population that treats it as new. It spreads. The spread is noticed by authorities. A narrative of danger is constructed, often in advance of complete evidence. The narrative drives policy. Policy is enacted. The substance continues. What makes the Mephedrone episode distinctive is its compression and its legibility. Everything happened in a shorter window and with clearer documentation than most drug panics of comparable scale. The legal period produced records. The vendors kept transactions. The users kept forum posts. The harm reduction community produced contemporaneous data on effects and prevalence. And the toxicology that contradicted the panic's central claims was produced and published while the events were still recent enough to compare to the claims. Usually this evidence disperses across years and becomes visible only in retrospect. With Mephedrone, it was all there within 18 months, clear enough to read as a connected argument rather than a contested history. What that argument says, simply stated, is this: a generation found something that worked, ordered it, used it, was not served well by the institutions that were supposed to protect them from harm, and was eventually left with a more dangerous version of the same problem by the policy response designed to solve it. The harm that occurred during the legal period was real. The harm that occurred after the ban was also real, and by most measures greater, and the ban's architects could not have been unaware that this was a likely outcome, because the literature describing exactly this outcome for earlier drug bans was available and had been cited in the assessments they were working from. There is no clean ending to the Mephedrone story. Not because the story is unresolved, in the United Kingdom at least it largely is, but because the questions it raised have not been resolved. What should governments do when a substance spreads faster than legislation can follow? What is the appropriate response when the science is incomplete and the political pressure is total? What is owed to the people who used a drug legally and found it criminalised before the evidence base for that criminalisation was established? What does it mean for drug policy that the tool most effective at maintaining quality and reducing harm in the Mephedrone era was not enforcement but consumer review culture? These questions were visible by 2012. They remain open. The generation that ordered from those websites is not mostly thinking about any of this. They are thinking about what people in their mid-30s tend to think about: work, children, mortgages, the texture of their particular lives. The period of their youth when a white powder arrived by post in a plain packet is part of a biographical accumulation that most of them have processed and moved past. But they carry something from it, even if they do not name it as such: the knowledge, embodied rather than abstract, that the systems designed to protect them from harm had failed them in a particular way, at a particular moment, in ways that were legible and documented and have not been substantially addressed. The correction to the Scunthorpe story ran smaller than the original report. The scientists who resigned in protest were not reinstated to the conditions that prompted their resignation. The law that was made on bad evidence remains the law. Nothing about the process changed. The next drug panic will run on the same rails. What the packet left behind, finally, is not a lesson. Lessons imply a learner, and the available evidence is not encouraging on the question of whether the relevant institutions have learned what was available to be learned. What it left behind is a record, a documentation of what happens when a drug moves at internet speed, and institutions move at the speed they always move. The record is detailed, contemporaneous, and publicly available. Whether it will be consulted the next time the situation calls for consulting, it is a separate question, and the answer to that question belongs to a future that has not yet arrived. The packet told you it was plant food. Nobody believed it. Nobody was supposed to. That was the arrangement. A fiction so thin you could see straight through it, maintained just long enough for the money to change hands, the powder to dissolve, and the whole thing to be someone else's problem by morning. And for a while, everyone honoured it. The government, the vendors, the users, the algorithms serving the ads. Everyone agreed to look at the label and not at what was in the packet. It worked until it didn't. Then it kept working anyway.